I hope everyone enjoyed the discussions. Thank you for coming and thank you for participating. Silence. Did everyone enjoy it?
We all work.
Yeah. So Alan and I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes wrapping up by talking about some of the takeaways from the discussions we've had over the past couple of days. And one of the things that sort of struck me was how in almost every discussion we discussed the need for community engagement. That this plan to double our forest cover by 2050, to plant 10 million trees starting next year, all those plans require engagement from the local communities. And we all have to really commit to figuring out how to do that. And we heard some examples of how it's been done in other places, from David Matenge from Kenya, from Maya from Lebanon, for example, from Omri from Israel, but it's going to be unique to Armenia. Armenia Tree Project's community tree planting program started that way on the ground in the villages, and we're in over 300 communities right now with our community tree planting sites. And what we found early on is that it won't succeed if you don't have the engagement of the community, the commitment, and the buy-in. So how do we scale that up so that we can get to 20% forest cover? That's one of the big questions we have to answer. Okay.
Maybe reflecting also on, go from keynote speaker to the first panel. I think some of the key messages that came through was Armenia has to figure out its own forest kind of future. There's no copy pasting of anywhere else solution you can bring from anywhere else here. And there's ample, as Hovik Sayarian mentioned, there's been massive studies done in the Soviet period, and I think maybe later on, about the kind of the palette of plants and the genetic kind of composition that we could use, genetic resources that we have to think about reforestation. The image of these northern kind of pine coniferous, forests, I think, is not something that we can just simply take and use. So we have to really think about the solution for our country and our climate and our various ecosystems. And Armenia itself is very diverse. So we are going to have different solutions in different parts of Armenia. I think that was one key message we need to take away. The other key message from the keynote speaker, and then Omri today also highlighted that we need to learn from others' experiences. I think, if we go, what most people would have learned, 40, 50 years ago, was that you plant very high dense plots, and then you end up with whatever you end up in 100 years down the line. And science has changed. People are doing better soil management, better water management, and there are approaches that you can adopt to lower that density, which means upfront costs go down considerably, from 3,000 plants per hectare to 1,000 maybe plants per hectare.
Okay, so do you want to talk about some of the things that came up when we were discussing rural energy?
Sure, but also about Vatan Urutian's comments.
This came up over and over again. I was struck by Vatan's comments when we did the panel on key challenges and opportunities for Armenia. He said we don't have enough specialists to handle this challenge of 10 million trees. And this came up over and over again. Just now I was upstairs in the panel about nurseries, and it came up again. We don't have enough specialists. I mean, we know that from our personal experience within ATP, that it's always a challenge to find specialists. So Armenia, if we're going to meet this challenge of doubling the forest cover, Armenia needs to commit to training new specialists, developing training programs, developing practical programs such as internships to train new specialists, and to make sure that the existing specialists are kept up to date in their training with the newest technologies.
Going then to the panel on rural energy demand, poverty, I think one of the key messages, well, there are several key messages there, but certainly our system today of rural heating is very inefficient. There's lots of losses in the system, from wet burning of wood, which Aspine was arguing about 60% loss there just because it's wet, to the inefficiency of the housing unit itself with lots of losses, the stoves that are used. She calculated about 90% of the energy used is lost due to bad practices or poor structures that we have. So that's a kind of, it's not, we can prioritize where to attack first, but I think that's an area that any forest conservation policy has to address, because you need to reduce the demand, and one of the reducing demands is to increase efficiency of energy use. Mm-hmm. And also in that panel, I think one of the key issues that we discussed is that the community issue came up, and Robert made a very, I think, astute remark that, you cannot alienate communities. And if you start alienating communities have a way of becoming the enemy of what you're trying to protect. And we should not even go that direction where that possibility, that risk is there. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think you covered everything on that one. International organizations.
Yeah. Do you want me to say something about it?
You were going to.
All right. So on international initiatives, very good discussion. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with Vatan Melikian that international coordination starts at the government level. It is a government function to coordinate international donors. It's not for AUA to coordinate or for civil society to coordinate donors. The government needs to coordinate, but what coordination or how it happens is if you have good programs and policies, and Vatan highlighted this, and I think that's correct, that coordination happens around a government policy and program. And when that policy program is in place and it's effectively working, coordination will naturally take place, or will be one of the functions of implementing the program.
And certainly we should continue these types of discussions so that as the government develops policies, it will have input from everyone who's on the ground implementing them.
Right.
Okay.
And also the other key message, I think, from the international cooperation panel was that, and this is probably related to the first point, that projects come and go. There has to be some institutional absorption of what is left behind. If there is none of that, then it becomes a series of outputs actually, that don't become an outcome together. And that's a very important thing to think. And that's where you go back to the government being the owner of the whole process. Mm-hmm. And biodiversity?
Biodiversity, yeah.
Okay, so on biodiversity, I think a key message was everyone is aware that when you're planting forests, you need to think about where you're planting the forest, because you may be destroying very valuable ecosystems in the process. A forest ecosystem does not necessarily mean a higher valued ecosystem. So there are various ecosystems, and you need to have in your process of deciding where you plant, you need to be able to identify where is the right place. And you need to ensure that biodiversity is not damaged, either because you're replacing an ecosystem. And the other issue that a lot of our scientists were concerned about is the introduction of invasive species, either flora or fauna, that could destroy the systems that you already have in place or severely damage them. And I think, another interesting aspect that was brought out is that biodiversity is not obviously only about flora, plant biodiversity, it's animal and also mushrooms, and their critical role they play, and understanding how all of these are interconnected in the survival and the growth of the forest is where we really need to be evidence and science-based in our approach.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting on that panel, somebody in an earlier discussion had brought up the possibility of importing seedlings in order to meet this 10 million tree demand. And everyone on the panel about biodiversity mentioned that they had serious concerns about that idea. So it's important for us to remember that as we move forward with this ambitious goal, that we are consulting the experts about all the possible ramifications.
And having the system in place, and experts may not know everything at any given point in time, but you have to have a system in place where you can test, you can bring in, you have to have a network of scientists around the world where you can ask them. And this is a ability that we need to have in Armenia, and universities have to be connected globally. Of course, the government is not necessarily going to be connected globally on these specific scientific issues. So there's a lot of role for different actors to play. And on the biodiversity, were you going to say something? Okay, I want to make one more point. Sandra Balayan pointed out that there are a number of administrative tools already that the government has, EIA being one of them, environmental impact assessment being one of them. If we're going to do large-scale program-level development, the strategic environmental assessment is another tool available, but also management plans that the Forest Service, different forest branches have, or the protected area has. These also have to be based on good understanding of biodiversity and biodiversity conservation and restoration.
Okay.
So then we get to the financing.
You had some comments about that.
Sure. On financing, I think, very good discussion. We understood that the financing world is very complex. And so, but one clear message was, you're not going to get a penny unless you have a good plan. And you know what you're doing. You can convince your donor or your lender or your investor that you have a good idea of what you're going to get at the end. Mm-hmm. And what you're going to get at the end, different donors will expect different outcomes. Some will want an environmental outcome, carbon sequestration capacity. Some will want, forest, biomass growth outcome. Some would want, a biodiversity outcome, but also some would want social outcomes, that you're not in the process degrading or deteriorating the livelihood of communities around forest areas, or you're going to want outcomes that are economic for the country. So there are different lenders, investors, and some, of course, if they're private investors, they're going to want return on their financial return on their investments.
Well, a good example of what Alan was just talking about is what we heard from Maya from Lebanon. She said that when the new government came in, they took on the project, and that's because they were so well organized with a clear plan and an explanation of how they would measure results. And so there's a great example of what you need to do. Okay, Omri.
Well, with Omri, of course, we in some ways, Omri's presentation I think rocked people's world, because
yes.
You brought a whole different approach to how you think about afforestation. Very different from the school of understanding of plants and how forests work in Armenia. I think that's where our academic institutions have to really connect. Our forest service has to connect, and our so there's a lot that we've learned from that presentation, and we look forward to continued cooperation.
Well, I think what I took away from it was it's a challenge for us to be creative in finding solutions to the problem of afforestation in Armenia. We could see how they did it in Israel. Israel's different from Armenia in many ways, but there are some similarities, and certainly we can learn lessons. I really appreciated that presentation, and I took a photo of every single slide that he showed.
All the slides will be we'll put it on our website. You can download it. Yeah.
All right.
Along with all the events, I think, are videotaped, so they're available.
Yeah. Okay. What was next?
Okay, next is, of course, David Matenge, who also rocked our world with the kind of work you do in terms of 5,000 groups being members of 5,700 groups being member of the Green Belt movement. This is how you mobilize people. This is an incredible example of how you get grassroots movement to do something good. And an incredible model of how all of that, very complex. It's not easy I think it's from 77 you've been working at this. So I think, there's a lot to be learned, and see how some of those ideas can be adopted to our reality in this country. I was
really inspired by that. We keep talking about engaging the community, and we look at how you've engaged the community. And of course, in Armenia, in rural areas, it is mostly women that we're dealing with. When you go to the villages, there aren't that many men who are there. So it will have a very similar experience in some ways. Okay.
Very good. And of course, Maya and Amy we already talked about, but I think the Firewise approach was also interesting, how you get communities ready, involved. And one of the parallel panels that we had, it is a clear disjunction between community and authorities when it comes to fire prevention and fire management. It's as if parents, children are the communities, authorities are parents, and parents will take care of everything. You just need to not interfere, right, and not be naughty. It's almost like that approach, which I think has to fundamentally change, because that's not how you achieve a greater outcome. And
So I attended the parallel panel on nurseries, and that was very interesting, but again, some similar themes from earlier discussions. Before we can start making plans for how we're going to fulfill the challenge of doubling the forest cover, we need to know how much land we're talking about that we're going to plant on. We need to improve the quality, quantity, and variety of seedlings. We need to answer the question of where are we going to get the seeds and how are we going to test them to ensure their quality. These are all big issues which need to be tackled in Armenia. Armenia Tree Project has had these issues on a small scale. The whole country is going to be dealing with it on a large scale. We've learned some lessons. We've developed some techniques. We now have some technology for seed testing, but we're not going to be able to do it for 10 million trees. Yeah. So that's a big one. And then there was one more parallel panel that neither...
Yeah, and Jason maybe can come in and tell us what this... But on the fire, if I could say one more thing while Jason's collecting his thoughts. Or maybe Yana, our moderator, is she here?
No.
Okay.
Jason.
So, Jason, come on up. On the fire prevention, I think also another key message that came through was there's a lot that's being done. There's a lot of capacity. The interagency connectedness, I think, is still an issue. Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Emergency Situation, Territorial Administration kind of working together. This is an issue that needs to be understood and maybe audited, and to understand where are the key gaps and what are the causes of those institutional gaps or bottlenecks or whatever the cause is. I don't know how we would end up characterizing it. And that's a very critical part to focus on. And to understand, because it has to be a system working, and no one agency can be the full accountable, responsible party for the outcomes or the process. So I think that's another very important one. So on the Jason, on the IT and technological innovation, what were some of the key takeaways?
Yeah, so we that panel had people representing organizations from different aspects of forestry, from the Forest Monitoring Center and the Cadastre. So there was discussion of, remote sensing, monitoring for illegal logging. We saw a model of a startup that's working actually with the Peruvian Amazon rainforest on monitoring, which was pretty big in scope.
Armenian company.
An Armenian company. Monitoring of protected areas. And environmental law enforcement using technology. I was really interested in Guy Heydrich's discussion of the importance of urban tree cover in the forestry plan, and how our urban forests have many environmental, social, and economic benefits to the country as well. So that can be sometimes a significant part of your tree cover and green infrastructure.
So, just a reminder, if you had any questions that you didn't have a chance to answer, please do email us. What's the email address again, Alan?
ace@aua.am. Aseye Shanik AUA.am.
We really want to get your feedback. As Alan mentioned earlier in the program, we are going to be working on developing a sort of white paper with summarizing the takeaways that we had from these important discussions. So your participation is appreciated.
Very good. And there are few things happening after this. There's some tours that some of you are on, and there's the student session that's happening. We're not calling it a student, our young leader session. That's happening after this. Yes, and there's some interesting presentations we'll be having. So whatever you attend, I think you will win.
Okay, so if you're going on one of the trips, the buses will be outside, and make your way outside. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been great. I really enjoyed it.